In 2012, a single life jacket sold at auction for $180,000. It was waterlogged, faded, and nearly a century old. The name stenciled on it in faint black letters was not that of a sailor, a captain, or a crew member. It belonged to a passenger, a first-class passenger, a man who had boarded the RMS Titanic in Southampton on April 10, 1912, with his 18-year-old bride, a valet, a manservant, a nurse, and a dog. He was 47 years old. He was worth, in today's money, somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. He was the single wealthiest person aboard a ship that was itself widely described as floating evidence that human beings had finally mastered the act of moving money across the Atlantic Ocean. His name was John Jacob Astor IV. He had built hotels. He had fought in a war. He had written a science fiction novel. He had survived scandals so spectacular that newspapers across 3 continents had spent 18 months describing him as a moral catastrophe wrapped in a Brooks Brothers suit. And on the night of April 14, 1912, he stood on the deck of the most famous ship in history in his shirt sleeves, watched his young wife step into a lifeboat, and asked the officer loading the boat whether he might join her. Lifeboat number 4. Madeline Astor, 18 years old and 5 months pregnant, seated inside. The officer said no. It was not a dramatic refusal. No argument. No negotiation. No exception made for the richest man on the ship. No. And John Jacob Astor IV, the man who had once used his family's vast wealth to reshape New York's skyline, who had dined with presidents, who had survived the full fury of Gilded Age society turning its collective back on him, turned away from the lifeboat and walked back into the ship. The money didn't matter. The hotels didn't matter. The Army colonel's commission didn't matter. None of it. Not the fortune, not the family name, not the decades of social power accumulated across 4 generations of aggressive American ambition. None of it changed the answer. The ocean doesn't negotiate with old money. What makes this story more than a tragedy, more than a footnote in the disaster's passenger manifest, is everything that came before that moment. The life that brought John Jacob Astor IV to that deck, to that lifeboat, to that answer. Because if you only know the ending, you're missing the most extraordinary part. You're missing the man. This is the story of an heir who was handed the greatest fortune in American history and didn't know what to do with it. A man who was too intellectual for the social world he was born into, too unconventional for the age he lived in, and too human for the mythology his family had constructed around themselves. He didn't just go down with the Titanic. He spent 47 years falling toward it. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. This channel is trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month. 1,000 people who believe that stories like this one deserve to be told carefully, told honestly, told the way history actually felt. If this is the kind of story you came here for, hitting that subscribe button right now would mean more than you know. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to what we're building here. Now, back to where we were, because what happened next changes everything. Chapter 1. The Foundation, from Fur to Fifth Avenue. The first John Jacob Astor arrived in America with almost nothing. A young German immigrant who stepped off a boat in Baltimore in 1784 with £4 sterling, 7 flutes to sell, and an ambition that would prove, in retrospect, to be one of the most consequential personality traits in American economic history. He had no connections. No family already established on American soil. No inherited capital. No letters of introduction, no safety net. What he had was a ferocious work ethic, an instinctive facility for trade, and a quality that would define every generation of Astors that came after him. The ability to see clearly and early exactly where value was going to accumulate. In 1784, value was accumulating in fur. The American interior was a vast, largely unmapped source of animal pelts, and the markets of London, Paris, and Hamburg were paying extraordinary prices for them. John Jacob understood this trade better than almost anyone operating in North America, and within a decade of his arrival, he had built the American Fur Company into the first great American business monopoly. He didn't just participate in the fur trade. He dominated it, through ruthlessness, through strategic partnerships with indigenous trading networks, and through the specific commercial genius of a man who understood that controlling the supply chain from trap to ship was worth more than simply being one trader among many. By the early 1800s, he had made his first fortune. Then he made his second. John Jacob Astor looked at New York City in the early 19th century and saw something that most people living in it did not. He saw the land underneath it. He understood, with the same cold, pattern-recognizing intelligence that had made him dominant in fur, that as New York grew northward, as the small colonial city expanded into the grid that the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 had begun to lay out across the length of Manhattan Island, the land that currently seemed remote and agricultural would become, within decades, some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. He began buying it, quietly, systematically, at rural prices. Farm plots and village lots and undeveloped acres that sellers were often relieved to convert to cash. When he died in 1848, John Jacob Astor was worth approximately $20 million, roughly equivalent to 1% of the entire U.S. GDP at the time. He was, by every reasonable measure, the wealthiest man in America. He had built his fortune entirely within a single lifetime, from 7 flutes and 4 pounds sterling to an empire of Manhattan real estate that would generate income for his descendants for the next century and a half. The dynasty he founded was not, initially, a social dynasty. It was a financial one. The first John Jacob was not particularly interested in the refinements of social position. He ate with his knife, allegedly kept poor table manners throughout his life, and was said by more than one contemporary to have the habits of a man who had spent years in rough commercial environments, which was, of course, exactly what he was. His wealth was vast and his social polish was minimal, and this combination made him a subject of fascination and mild condescension in the New York of his day. His son, William Backhouse Astor Sr., was more refined, and his son William Backhouse Astor Jr. more refined still. The fortune growing in each generation while the rough immigrant origins receded, the family climbing with each decade further into the crystallized upper atmosphere of New York society, accumulating the social legitimacy that the first John Jacob had never possessed or particularly wanted. By the time the 4th generation arrived, the Astor name was not just synonymous with wealth. It was synonymous with American aristocracy, with the particular kind of old money authority that the Gilded Age, for all its new industrial fortunes, still treated as the highest form of social currency. Into this world, this specific, stratified, enormously pressurized world, John Jacob Astor IV was born on July 13, 1864. He was heir to all of it: the fortune, the name, the social position, the expectations. He was also, from almost the beginning, profoundly, quietly, unmistakably unsuited to all of it. Chapter 2. The Cage, Caroline and the 400. To understand John Jacob Astor IV, you first have to understand his mother. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor was not born into the Astor family. She married into it in 1853, bringing with her a social pedigree that was, in the particular calculus of New York's mid-century upper class, arguably superior to the Astor name itself. The Schermerhorns were Old Dutch New York, the kind of family that had been prominent in the city since before the Revolution, the kind of family that measured its position in generations rather than in dollars. Caroline Astor had strong views about what wealth was for. It was not, in her understanding, simply a means of comfortable living. It was a social instrument, a mechanism for creating and maintaining a defined, exclusive, morally serious upper class that would function as the cultural backbone of American civilization. She believed in this project with the conviction of a woman who had decided, sometime in her 20s, that she was going to be its most important practitioner. She largely succeeded. By the 1870s, Mrs. Astor, she required only the one name in New York, like a monarch, had established herself as the unquestioned queen of what became known as the 400. The name derived, allegedly, from the capacity of her ballroom on Fifth Avenue, a room that could hold approximately 400 people and which functioned, in Mrs. Astor's social vision, as a working definition of who mattered in New York. If you were invited to Mrs. Astor's ball, you existed socially. If you were not invited, you did not, regardless of how much money you had made in steel or railroads or oil. New money, in Mrs. Astor's taxonomy, was not the same as old money, and the distinction was not negotiable. She worked with her social arbiter Ward McAllister to codify the rules of this world with a precision that would have been impressive in any institutional context. Dress, behavior, marriage, conversation, the right clubs, the right summer addresses, the right manner of entering a room, and the right manner of leaving one. Every detail of upper-class life had a correct form and an incorrect form, and Mrs. Astor knew them all and enforced them with an authority that nobody who wanted to remain in her orbit could afford to ignore. This was the world into which John Jacob Astor IV was born. His father, William Astor, was a mostly absent figure, a man more comfortable on his yacht or at his estate at Ferncliff than in the demanding social performances that Caroline organized and presided over. He left the family's social direction entirely to his wife and spent much of his time at sea, which was arguably a form of survival strategy. Young Jack, as John Jacob IV was known within the family, was his mother's favorite child. This was both a privilege and a pressure. It meant he was given every advantage: private tutors, travel abroad, the finest education that the Astor fortune could provide. It also meant he was expected to embody the Astor ideal, to be the living demonstration that 4 generations of accumulated wealth and social investment had produced something genuinely distinguished. He was sent to St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, then to Harvard, which he attended in the late 1880s. By every account, he was a thoughtful, quiet student, genuinely interested in science and engineering, drawn to ideas in ways that the social world his mother presided over had little space for. He graduated in 1888. He was 24 years old, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in American history, master of multiple estates, and possessed of a first-rate mind that had no obvious place to go inside the world he had been born into. The heir to America's most prominent social dynasty would prove to be profoundly uncomfortable in the world his mother had created. He would spend the next decade and a half trying, in his own quiet way, to find the edges of it, to locate the places where the rules bent, or where a man with his particular combination of wealth and intellectual curiosity might do something genuinely interesting. He would find those edges, and when he did, he would discover that the world Caroline Astor had built was very much less forgiving than it appeared. Chapter 3. The Inventor, A Mind Out of Place. The thing that tends to get lost in the Titanic narrative, in the drama of the ship, the scandal of the divorce, the spectacle of the young second wife, is this: John Jacob Astor IV was genuinely brilliant. Not in the vague, complimentary sense that wealthy men of his era were often described as brilliant. In a specific, documented, technically literate sense. He was fascinated by science and engineering at a moment when those fields were transforming the physical world at a pace that no previous generation had experienced. And his fascination was not that of a dilettante who wrote checks to other people's projects. He worked on things himself. In 1894, he patented a bicycle brake improvement. In 1898, he patented a pneumatic road improver, a device designed to smooth the surface preparation process for roads being built to accommodate the early automobile. He designed and patented improvements to turbine engines. He held multiple patents in an era when most men of his social position considered manual or technical work beneath their station. His approach to property management was similarly unusual. Where previous Astor generations had been content to collect rents from Manhattan real estate, a passive, enormously lucrative activity that required relatively little management attention, John Jacob IV took an active interest in his properties in ways his grandfather would not have recognized. He was involved in the design of the Astoria Hotel, which opened in 1897 on Fifth Avenue, and which was, at the time of its construction, one of the most technically sophisticated hotel buildings in the world. When his cousin William Waldorf Astor's adjacent Waldorf Hotel was combined with the Astoria to create the Waldorf-Astoria complex, John Jacob was centrally involved in making the combined facility function as a genuine architectural and hospitality achievement, not merely an exercise in expensive decoration. He also wrote a book, Astor's Managed Property. They did not write fiction, but the book itself proved even more surprising. Published in 1894 under the title A Journey in Other Worlds, it was a science fiction novel set in the year 2000, featuring a solar-powered spacecraft making an interplanetary tour of Jupiter and Saturn. It explored questions of evolution, technology, and the future of human civilization with a seriousness and intellectual ambition that genuinely surprised the reviewers who bothered to read it. It was not a masterpiece. It was the work of a man who had more ideas than literary craft. But it was real, genuinely imagined, genuinely speculative, full of specific technical proposals that reflected an authentic engagement with the science of his day. It was the kind of book that a man writes when he has something to say and enough privilege to say it. And the something he had to say was that the world was changing faster than the social frameworks designed to contain it. He was describing himself, though he may not have fully known it. The world that Caroline Astor had built, the 400, the ballroom, the social hierarchy with its rigid rules about who mattered and how much, was exactly the kind of static structure that Astor's science fiction imagined being transformed. The old certainties dissolved. The future arrived whether you invited it or not. He was trying to live in two worlds simultaneously: the inherited world of Astor's social authority, with its estates and its obligations and its suffocating formality, and the emerging world of the late 19th century, where ideas moved fast and the rules were still being written. He was not, in this, unique among the heirs of great Gilded Age fortunes. But he was more conscious of the tension than most, more uncomfortable with the performance required of him, more genuinely interested in the actual content of the ideas his era was producing. And there was another dimension to his discomfort, one that would, in the first years of the new century, erupt into the most spectacular public scandal of his life. Beneath the patents and the science fiction novel and the hotel management, beneath the careful performance of Astor's social obligation, John Jacob IV was a man who had chosen, at considerable cost and deliberation, to make a bad marriage. Or rather, a correct marriage, correct by every external standard, that had proved, over the years, to be quietly entirely wrong. He had married Ava Lowell Willing of Philadelphia in 1891. She was beautiful, socially impeccable, and utterly incompatible with him. She was also, by multiple contemporary accounts, one of the most socially ambitious women in a city full of socially ambitious women. A quality that might have been an asset in a different marriage, and was, in theirs, a steady source of mutual misery. By 1909, after 18 years, he had had enough. Chapter 4. The Scandal. Divorce in the Gilded Age. Divorce in 1909, for a family like the Astors, was not merely a personal matter. It was a public catastrophe, a declaration of institutional failure, an act that the social world Caroline Astor had spent 50 years constructing treated, essentially, as treason. The rules of Gilded Age society on the subject of marriage were simple and absolute. You chose correctly, or you performed correctly, or you did both. What you did not do, what no one in the 400 did, not if they wished to remain in the 400, was formally dissolve the performance. Because the performance, in Caroline Astor's world, was the thing. The appearance of a sound and proper marriage was not merely a social nicety. It was foundational. It was load-bearing. Remove it, and the entire structure of social respectability began to tremble. John Jacob Astor IV filed for divorce from Ava Lowell Willing Astor in 1909 on grounds of abandonment. The response was immediate and merciless. The newspapers, and the newspapers of 1909, it should be understood, operated in an era before the legal protections and professional norms that would later constrain American journalism. An era when the private lives of wealthy public figures were considered entirely fair game for the most aggressive coverage imaginable. The newspapers treated the Astor divorce as a sustained national entertainment event. Column inches devoted to the question of fault, the question of finances, the question of which Astor properties would go to which party. Society columnists, who in normal circumstances maintained a tactful discretion about the internal dynamics of the families they covered, abandoned that discretion entirely. Mrs. Astor, the elder Mrs. Astor Caroline, who had died in 1908, was not alive to see it. This was perhaps the only mercy available. But the divorce itself, which was finalized in 1910, was only the beginning. Because John Jacob Astor IV, at 46 years old, with one failed marriage concluded and a new freedom in hand, did exactly what every person who knew him professionally predicted he would not do, and every instinct he had personally been accumulating for decades suggested he would. He fell in love. Her name was Madeline Talmadge Force. She was 18 years old. He was 46. The age gap, 28 years, would have been, in different circumstances, a matter of social commentary. In the context of John Jacob Astor IV, freshly divorced and the richest man in New York, with a fortune that operated as both his greatest asset and his most visible social characteristic, it became a matter of sustained national outrage. The engagement was announced in 1911. The reaction was instantaneous. Every social sanction available to the world his family had dominated for 3 generations was deployed against him. Invitations were withdrawn. Society hostesses who had spent years cultivating their connections to the Astor name declined, publicly, to receive him. The Episcopal Church refused to marry them, a refusal that carried, in the social context of 1911 New York, an almost excommunicatory weight. He found a minister willing to perform the ceremony, and they married at Beechwood, the Astor estate in Newport, in September of 1911. The guest list was small. Many people who would, under normal circumstances, have been present were not. The wedding that should have been a social event of the first magnitude was, instead, a ceremony notable primarily for who was absent. But we will return to that marriage and its eventual reception in full. For now, what matters is the decision that John Jacob Astor IV made in the aftermath of the wedding. He decided to leave. Not permanently. Not in any final sense. He and Madeline departed for an extended European and Egyptian honeymoon in the fall of 1911. A strategic retreat as much as a romantic journey. A way of removing themselves from the immediate blast radius of the scandal and allowing time to begin doing what time, even in the most rigid social worlds, eventually does, muting the sharpest edges of outrage, allowing for the slow readjustment of positions. By early 1912, Madeline was 5 months pregnant with their child. John Jacob decided it was time to come home. They booked passage on the finest ship in the world. The RMS Titanic was making its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York in April 1912. It was, by the standards of its day, a technical marvel. The largest moving object ever built, a floating demonstration of what the early 20th century understood itself to be capable of. They boarded at Cherbourg, France, on the evening of April 10th. 4 days later, the world would change. Chapter 5. The Ship, the Titanic, and its World. The RMS Titanic, it is worth understanding, was not simply a ship. It was a statement, a material argument, made in steel and glass and Jacobean paneling and Olympic-grade first-class staterooms, that the civilization which had produced it had achieved something close to mastery of the physical world. The White Star Line had commissioned the Titanic and its sister ship, the Olympic, as the definitive answer to the question of what first-class transatlantic travel could be if the answer to every question was more. More space, more luxury, more stability, more technical sophistication. The Titanic stretched 882 feet from bow to stern. It displaced 46,000 tons of water. Its first-class section contained a swimming pool, a squash court, a Turkish bath, a gymnasium, and a dining saloon that seated 552 people under ceilings that rose to nearly 9 feet. It was, in short, a floating environment designed to make the richest people in the world feel that the ocean had been domesticated. That the old terror of Atlantic crossings, the storms, the uncertainty, the fundamental danger of placing human beings on a ship in the middle of a vast and indifferent sea, had been engineered away. That technology had finally definitively won. John Jacob Astor IV and Madeline were traveling in first class, in a suite comprising 2 bedrooms, a sitting room, a private promenade deck, and 2 wardrobe rooms. Their personal party, valet Victor Robbins, maid Rosalie Bidois, nurse Caroline Endres, and Kitty, the Airedale Terrier, occupied adjacent accommodations. The passenger list of the Titanic's first class was a remarkable social document in itself. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to the Guggenheim mining fortune. Margaret Brown, the Colorado silver heiress who would later become known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Isidore Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveling with his wife Ida. Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, whose survival would later become the subject of controversy. Arthur Ryerson, the Pennsylvania steel magnate. It was, in miniature, a portrait of Gilded Age wealth. The accumulated fortunes of American and European industrial capitalism, gathered in one place for 4 days. And at the summit of this social pyramid, by any measure of wealth, sat John Jacob Astor IV. The crossing had been, until the night of April 14th, entirely pleasant. The weather had been exceptionally calm for the North Atlantic in early April. Unusually so, the kind of smooth passage that seemed to validate every promise the White Star Line had made about the comfort of its flagship. The sea was flat. The air was cold but clear. The days passed in the specific, comfortable rhythm of Edwardian first-class shipboard life. Meals, walks on the deck, reading in the lounge, evenings in the dining saloon. John Jacob spent time in the ship's gym with the physical trainer. He played with Kitty on the deck. He spoke with other passengers, including, on the Sunday of April 14th, a conversation with young Jack Thayer, the 17-year-old son of a Pennsylvania Railroad vice president, who would later write about Astor's quiet, composed demeanor. Madeline, 5 months pregnant and occasionally unwell, rested often. He was by all accounts attentive to her, checking in regularly, ensuring she was comfortable, the kind of careful attention that characterized his behavior throughout the honeymoon trip. Whatever else the marriage had cost him, whatever the social world had said about it, he appeared genuinely happy in it. The scandal would have destroyed a lesser family. For the Astors, it was merely the beginning of a reckoning that had not yet, on the evening of April 14th, 1912, arrived at its final chapter. At dinner that night, John Jacob and Madeline ate in the first-class dining saloon and retired relatively early. Madeline was tired. The ship was moving at just under 22 knots through flat, dark water. The temperature was dropping sharply. In the crow's nest, 80 feet above the waterline, Lookout Frederick Fleet had been staring into the darkness for the past 2 hours. He had no binoculars. They had been locked in a storage cabinet somewhere between Southampton and the sea, the key misplaced in the reorganization of crew assignments. He was looking with his naked eyes. He was looking hard. Chapter 6. The Night, April 14th, 1912. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, 1912, Frederick Fleet spotted something in the darkness directly ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. First Officer Murdoch ordered the ship turned hard to starboard and the engines reversed. The Titanic, 882 feet long and moving at nearly 22 knots, began the slow, enormous physics of a course correction. It was not enough. 37 seconds after Fleet's warning, the iceberg made contact with the starboard side of the hull below the waterline. The collision was not, to those in the interior of the ship, dramatic. Passengers in first class described hearing a grinding, scraping noise. Some thought the ship had shed a propeller blade, or that a large wave had struck the hull. Several people didn't wake up at all. In the first-class smoking room, card players paused, looked at each other, and returned to their game. But below the waterline, in the forward compartments of the ship, seawater was entering through a series of openings along the starboard hull. Not a single massive gash, but a sequence of smaller breaches, buckled seams, and compromised riveted plates extending approximately 300 feet from the bow. The damage was enough to flood 6 watertight compartments. The Titanic had been designed to float with 4 flooded. With 6, the mathematics were absolute and irreversible. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, was called to inspect the damage. He walked the forward sections with Captain Smith, carrying out calculations in his head that he had hoped he would never have to perform. When he gave his assessment, he did it quietly, in a tone that the people present later described as almost preternaturally calm. The ship, he told the captain, had approximately 1 to 2 hours. The time was approximately 12:05 a.m. on April 15th. John Jacob Astor IV was in his stateroom when he felt the impact. He went out to investigate and was told in the initial, underinformed response of the first hours that the ship had struck ice. He went back to the stateroom and dressed himself, and told Madeline to dress as well and to put on her life preserver. He was calm. This is one of the consistencies in every account from people who encountered him that night. His composure. Not the frozen, paralyzed composure of shock, but the deliberate, considered composure of a man who had decided how he intended to behave and was behaving accordingly. He escorted Madeline up to the boat deck, where the lifeboats were beginning to be loaded. Around them, the scene was shifting from the minor inconvenience of a late-night disturbance into something harder to name. The ship's band had begun playing on the deck. The night was clear and absolutely still and bitterly cold, the stars brilliant above a flat, dark ocean, and the slight but unmistakable forward tilt of the ship was becoming perceptible to anyone who was paying careful attention. The lifeboats were a problem that the Titanic's designers and owners had not chosen to solve adequately. The ship carried 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people aboard. The mathematics were not complicated. The loading was chaotic in ways that would later consume years of inquiry and analysis. Some boats were lowered partially filled. The protocols for who went first, women and children, the policy stated, though the implementation varied by officer and by deck, were understood and followed inconsistently. The class divisions of the ship were, in some areas, replicated in the loading of the boats. In others, the night operated as its own rough democracy. At lifeboat number 4, on the port side of the ship, Madeline Astor was preparing to board. It was approximately 1:45 a.m. The ship's bow was now visibly, significantly lower in the water. There was perhaps 40 minutes remaining. John Jacob Astor assisted Madeline into the boat and asked Officer Harold Low whether, given his wife's condition, 5 months pregnant, visibly unwell from the cold and the shock, he might be permitted to board as well. Low said no. Women and children first. No exceptions. Astor accepted this. He asked for the boat's number, Lifeboat 4, and told Madeline he would board another boat and meet her in New York. Then he turned away. What he did in the next 40 or so minutes is only partially documented. He was seen on deck by multiple survivors. He was reportedly composed throughout. He was seen helping other women to boats. He was seen walking. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. 20 minutes past 2. April 15th. Chapter 7. The Water, Survival and Its Calculus. The North Atlantic on the night of April 14th, 1912, was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water. Salt water freezes at a slightly lower temperature, which is why the ocean wasn't ice. The people in it were a different matter. Immersion in water at that temperature produces incapacitation in approximately 15 minutes. Death from hypothermia in 30 to 90 minutes, depending on body composition and physical condition. These are not dramatic numbers. They are physiological facts, and they determine the outcome for the majority of the 1,500 people who entered the water when the Titanic sank. There were 710 survivors. There were 1,517 dead. The lifeboats, the few that had been loaded to reasonable capacity and the majority that had not, floated in the darkness as the ship went down. Those in the boats later described the noise, the sound of 1,500 people in the water. The sound lasted, by most accounts, approximately 20 minutes. Then the cold did what the cold does, and the sound stopped, and the ocean was silent again under the stars. Madeline Astor in lifeboat number 4 survived. She was rescued by the RMS Carpathia, which had received the Titanic's distress calls and driven through the night at maximum speed to reach the site. The Carpathia arrived at approximately 4:10 a.m., well after the Titanic had sunk and well after the water had completed its work. When Madeline arrived in New York on April 18th aboard the Carpathia, she was met by the specific, agonizing combination of medical attention, press attention, and family attention that characterized the reception of Titanic survivors. She was 18 years old, 5 months pregnant, and a widow. The body of John Jacob Astor IV was recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett on April 22nd, 8 days after the sinking. He was identified by his initials, JJ, engraved on his personal effects. He was wearing a blue serge suit. His effects included a gold pocket watch, gold and diamond cufflinks, a diamond ring, a silver flask, and a small amount of cash. His body bore evidence of having been in contact with the ship's collapsing structure. Not the water, but the ship itself in its final minutes. He was 47 years old. The recovery of his body provided a specific, tangible closure that was denied to many of the 1,517 who died that night. The Mackay Bennett, which was sent specifically to recover first-class passengers and which carried embalming supplies and canvas bags for the bodies. One of the grimmer administrative facts of the disaster's aftermath, returned 306 bodies to Halifax. Of those, 116 were buried at sea because they could not be identified, were too decomposed to be transported, or were third-class passengers whose families had no resources to claim them. John Jacob Astor IV was not buried at sea. He was brought home to New York in a sealed coffin. He was interred at Trinity Church Cemetery in Upper Manhattan, where several of his Astor ancestors were also buried. The response to his death was complicated in a way that reflected the complicated nature of his life. There was genuinely public mourning. The magnitude of the loss was real, the circumstances were terrible, and whatever the Society columnists had said about his divorce and his second marriage, the manner of his death had a dignity to it that even his critics could not deny. He had put his pregnant young wife in a lifeboat. He had accepted the officer's refusal without argument or special pleading. He had turned away from the boat and not come back. But there was also, threading through the coverage, the specific uncomfortable recognition that the Titanic's death toll had been shaped by class in ways that the Gilded Age's self-mythology could not entirely absorb. The percentages were stark. First-class male passengers had a survival rate of approximately 33%. Third-class female passengers had a survival rate of approximately 46%. Higher than the wealthiest men on the ship, but lower than first- or second-class women. The richest man on the ship had died. More than 2/3 of the people in steerage had died. The numbers arranged themselves into an uncomfortable argument about what the Titanic's most famous night had actually demonstrated about the civilization that built it. The argument has not gone away. Chapter 8. The widow, Madeline's inheritance. Madeline Talmadge Force Astor arrived back in New York as a widow at 18 years old, and the world that had spent 18 months treating her as a scandal received her, suddenly and uncomplicatedly, as a tragedy. This was the alchemy of disaster. The thing that the social world could not forgive. The young second wife, the unseemly age gap, the divorce that had preceded her, the wedding to which half of New York society had declined its invitation. All of it dissolved in the Atlantic, replaced by the simpler, more powerful narrative of the young woman in the lifeboat, 5 months pregnant, watching the ocean close over the man she had married. Whatever the columnists had written about Madeline Force before April 15, 1912, nobody wrote those things afterward. She gave birth to John Jacob Astor IV on August 14, 1912, 4 months after his father's death. The boy was born into both the greatest fortune and the most famous shipwreck in American history, a combination that would define his public identity for the rest of his life in ways that had nothing to do with who he actually was. Under the terms of John Jacob Astor IV's will, Madeline received approximately $5 million in trust, a sum that was, by any ordinary measure, enormous, and that was, by Astor standards, notably modest. She also received the Beechwood estate in Newport and the use of the 840 Fifth Avenue mansion for as long as she remained unmarried. The condition was specific. If she remarried, the trust income ended, the properties reverted to the estate, and she would retain only the $5 million principal. This provision was not unusual for wills of the period. It was, however, a constraint that would shape the next decade of Madeline's life in ways that the man who wrote it, presumably without anticipating that he would be gone at 47, had not fully considered. She did not remarry immediately. She moved through the years following 1912 in a state of considerable public visibility and considerable private complexity, raising her son in the specific, pressurized environment of the Astor social world while remaining, herself, in the particular social limbo of the young wealthy widow. Simultaneously courted and constrained, desired and watched. She eventually remarried in 1916, for years after the sinking, to William Carl Dick. The conditions of the Astor will activated immediately. She gave up the trust income and the properties. She remarried again in 1933, after a divorce from Dick, to Enzo Firmont, an Italian boxer 20 years her junior, in an echo, though nobody said this at the time, of the scandal her first marriage had generated. She died in 1940 at 46 years old. She had outlived John Jacob Astor IV by 28 years, long enough to see her son grow up, long enough to see the world that had defined her life as a scandal, and then as a tragedy move on entirely, long enough to see the Gilded Age become something that people were already beginning to study in history books. The son, John Jacob Astor VI, inherited the remainder of his father's fortune through the estate mechanism and grew up within the specific, peculiar confines of extreme inherited wealth. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He was married multiple times. He was photographed frequently by the kind of press that followed the movements of famous inheritors. He died in 1992. The Astor fortune, by then, had been through a century of the specific financial physics that apply to large inherited estates in a democratic country without aristocratic succession laws. Taxation, division, dilution, expenditure. The family that had owned 1% of American GDP in 1848 was no longer in that position. The empire of Manhattan real estate had been sold and subdivided and redeveloped. The grand houses were gone. The Fifth Avenue mansion demolished, Beechwood sold and converted. The Waldorf Astoria name existing on a different building in a different location, owned by different people entirely. What remained was the name, and the story, and the specific haunting quality of the Astor narrative, the way it traces, in a single family across 4 generations, the full arc of American ambition. From nothing to everything, from everything to dynasty, from dynasty to scandal, from scandal to disaster, from disaster to memory. The fourth John Jacob stands at the center of that arc. Not as its hero, not as its villain, as its hinge. The man in whom all of the accumulated weight of the family's history met the accumulated weight of history itself, and found, as all such meetings eventually do, a point of collapse. Chapter 9. The Inquiry. What the hearings revealed. 6 days after the Titanic sank, the United States Senate convened an inquiry into the disaster at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. There is an irony in this location that has not gone unremarked by historians. The Waldorf Astoria, the hotel that bore the name of the family whose patriarch had just died in the disaster being investigated, hosting the official American government examination of how that disaster had been allowed to happen. The carpets in the hearing room had been laid over floors that John Jacob Astor IV himself had helped design. The walls were hung with the kind of expensive, tasteful appointments that characterized all Astor properties. The senators convening their inquiry were sitting, in other words, inside a monument to the very civilization whose assumptions the Titanic had just so catastrophically tested. Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan chaired the inquiry. He was not a nautical expert. This was noted, with varying degrees of condescension, by the British press, which considered an American Senate inquiry into a British ship's conduct to be a presumptuous exercise in jurisdiction, and considered Senator Smith's apparent unfamiliarity with basic nautical terminology to be the inevitable result of appointing landlocked politicians to investigate maritime disasters. Smith did not particularly care. He proceeded. What the hearings revealed was a systematic portrait of how the Titanic had come to be in an ice field at full speed on a moonless night, and how its disaster protocols had failed to preserve the majority of those aboard. The testimony was sometimes contradictory, sometimes self-serving, and occasionally extraordinary. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line and a first-class passenger who had survived by boarding a lifeboat at the final moment, testified under Smith's questioning with the specific, uncomfortable discomfort of a man who has done something that he cannot entirely explain without implicating himself. The press coverage of Ismay's survival, while more than 1,500 people did not survive, was relentless and largely merciless. He was characterized in editorials on both sides of the Atlantic as a coward. He spent the rest of his life largely withdrawn from public life, and died in 1937, having never fully escaped the characterization. Charles Lightoller, the Titanic's second officer and the most senior surviving crew member, gave testimony that was precise, loyal to the White Star Line, and, as subsequent historical analysis has demonstrated, carefully structured to protect both the company and his own professional reputation from the most damaging possible conclusions. The inquiry eventually produced a report that identified multiple contributing factors to the disaster. The speed at which the ship had been traveling through known ice fields, the inadequacy of the lifeboat provision, the failures in the loading protocols that had resulted in boats being launched partially filled, and the absence of adequate binoculars for the lookouts. It recommended specific changes to maritime safety regulations, including requirements for sufficient lifeboat capacity for all persons aboard, mandatory lifeboat drills, 24-hour radio watch on passenger vessels, and improved ice warning protocols. These recommendations became the basis for the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, signed in 1914, which established the framework for maritime safety standards that, in updated forms, remains in effect today. John Jacob Astor IV appears throughout the inquiry testimony as a presence rather than a subject, mentioned by survivors who had encountered him that night, noted for his composure, noted for the manner in which he placed his wife in the lifeboat and accepted the refusal to join her. He appears, in these fragments of testimony, as a man who had chosen, in the last hour of his life, exactly who he wanted to be. There is something in this that resists easy interpretation. The man who had scandalized America by divorcing his first wife and marrying a woman 28 years his junior. The man who had spent 47 years being slightly, quietly, persistently out of step with the world that claimed him, had, in the specific crucible of the Titanic's last hours, performed the role that his social world would have written for him perfectly. He had been calm. He had been selfless. He had accepted the constraints of an unjust situation, a ship with too few lifeboats, a protocol that sent poor people in steerage to the bottom while it debated who among the wealthy should board first, without raging against them. Whether this was dignity or resignation, whether it was the authentic expression of a character formed over a lifetime or the final performance of a man trained from birth to maintain composure regardless of cost, is a question that the available evidence cannot answer with certainty. Perhaps it was both. Chapter 10, The Legacy, What Astor Means Now. More than 100 years have passed since the Titanic sank. The world that produced it, the Gilded Age, with its extraordinary concentrations of private wealth, its rigid social hierarchies, its genuine belief in progress as an essentially technological problem that money and engineering could eventually solve, that world is gone. Not entirely, and not without successors, but gone in its specific, crystallized 19th century form. What remains is the story. The Titanic story, in particular, has shown a cultural durability that would have surprised the people who experienced it as news rather than history. The disaster has been the subject of multiple major films, dozens of documentaries, hundreds of books, a long-running Broadway musical, and one of the most successful museum exhibitions in the history of the medium. The wreck itself, discovered by Robert Ballard in 1985, and subsequently the subject of deep-sea tourism ventures whose ethics remain actively contested, has a tourist infrastructure. There are people alive today who have paid significant sums of money to descend 2.5 miles to the seafloor and look at its rusted hull. John Jacob Astor IV occupies a specific position within this cultural persistence. He is the disaster's most iconic wealthy casualty. The figure whose presence on the ship most perfectly embodies the Titanic's symbolic function as an equalizer, as the event that demonstrated, in terms that even the most socially conservative observers could not entirely dismiss, that the money did not, in the end, help. James Cameron's 1997 film used the Astors as background. The older wealthy couple dressing formally as the ship sinks, a visual reference to the historical record. A shorthand for a certain kind of Gilded Age dignity that the film used as contrast to its fictional working-class protagonists. The moment is brief and deliberately ambiguous. It says, "These people also died, and they also knew how to die." The artifacts of his life continue to surface and be valued. The pocket watch recovered with his body, engraved with his initials, JJA, has passed through multiple collections and auction houses. Personal effects, documents, photographs command prices that reflect not just the historical significance of the Titanic disaster, but the specific, powerful narrative energy of the Astor story. A man who had everything, on a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, in a social world that believed itself to have mastered the conditions of its own existence. The watch kept time for a man who ran out of it. The broader legacy of the Astors as a dynasty is more complicated and more ambiguous than the clean narrative arc of the Titanic story suggests. The family's accumulation of Manhattan real estate in the 19th century was simultaneously a story of commercial genius and a story of displacement. The Irish and German immigrants who lived in Astor-owned tenements in the mid-19th century, in conditions that contemporary reformers documented as among the worst in the city, are part of the Astor story too, though they appear in it without names, without individual faces, as a collective presence. John Jacob IV was not personally responsible for his family's 19th century tenement practices. He was born in 1864, and the worst of those practices had been modified before his active involvement in family affairs. But he was the heir to the fortune they helped build. He lived on the income they had generated. The money in his pocket on the night of April 14th, 1912, was connected, through a chain of years and transactions and human suffering, to those tenements on the Lower East Side. This is not a reason to diminish the specific dignity of the man on the deck of the Titanic. It is a reason to hold both things at once. The dignity and the inheritance, the genuine courage of a last hour and the long, complicated shadow of the fortune that placed him in that particular last hour. What John Jacob Astor IV actually wanted, beneath the patents, the science fiction novel, the scandal, the young wife, the careful composure of the deck, is ultimately inaccessible to us. The documentary record is extensive, and the inner life is opaque, as inner lives always are across the distance of a century. What we have is the outline of a man who was given more than any person reasonably needs, and spent his life being quietly, persistently unhappy with the form in which it came. Who built things with his hands when his social world said hands were for signing checks. Who wrote fiction when his family wrote leases, who loved the wrong person, by his world's definition, and paid for it in social exile, and then came home on a ship that was making a statement about the permanence of the civilization that had exiled him, and who, in the final 40 minutes of his life, was calm. We cannot know what he was thinking. We cannot know whether the calm was peace or performance or something that had, by that point, ceased to be distinguishable from the other. We know only that he stood on the deck in his shirt sleeves in the cold, and that the ship went down, and that he went with it. The ocean is not interested in your worth. It is not interested in your hotels, or your patents, or your family name, or the specific, painful shape of the life you managed to make from the materials the world handed you. It does not reward courage or punish scandal, or honor the dignity of a good death. It simply receives what it receives. What it received on a cold, clear night in April 1912 was the whole accumulated weight of a life that had been, in its own quiet way, extraordinary. Chapter 11. The Myth: How History Remembers the Rich Who Died. There is a particular way that history remembers wealthy people who die in disasters. It is not the same way it remembers everyone else. The poor who die in disasters are remembered as statistics. As aggregated human loss, cataloged by class and deck and survival rate, and eventually abstracted into the language of policy reform and regulation and the slow, technical improvements that their deaths are used to justify. They are the argument. They are rarely the individuals. The wealthy dead become individuals. They are given names and backstories and specific, humanizing final moments. The card players who kept playing, Isidore and Ida Strauss who refused to separate, the figures of Gilded Age authority who maintained their composure as the water rose. These moments are real. They happened, they were witnessed and recorded, and there is genuine value in preserving them. But the preservation is uneven in ways that reflect the same hierarchies that shaped the disaster itself. John Jacob Astor IV has been remembered more fully and more specifically than most of the people who died with him. This is partly the function of his fame. He was famous before the Titanic, and the disaster made him more so. It is partly the function of his wealth, which meant that his estate generated records, his recovery was documented carefully, his biography was considered worth writing. And it is partly the function of the specific narrative power of his story. The richest man on the ship, the scandalous marriage, the dignity of the final hour. But the specific quality of his posthumous reputation is worth examining, because it has undergone significant revision over the decades. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, he was broadly eulogized as a hero. The manner of his death, the refusal to pull rank or money to secure a place in a lifeboat, was contrasted favorably with J. Bruce Ismay's survival, and presented as evidence of a certain kind of aristocratic honor. The richest man on the ship died so that his wife might live. The story was clean and it was satisfying, and it did important cultural work in a moment when the disaster had raised uncomfortable questions about what wealth and power were actually for. Over the following decades, as historians began examining the social structure of the disaster more critically, who survived and why, what the class breakdown of the casualties actually demonstrated, the eulogistic version became more complicated. The dignity of Astor's death was not in question. The system that had built the ship with insufficient lifeboats, the system that had loaded those lifeboats with disparate attention to the welfare of different classes of passengers, the system in which Astor had been a prominent and wealthy beneficiary throughout his life. That system was harder to entirely separate from the man. The current historical consensus is, appropriately, neither pure eulogium nor pure critique. It is the recognition that John Jacob Astor IV was a human being of genuine complexity. Intellectually curious, emotionally sincere, brave in a specific and documented moment, and also the product and beneficiary of structural inequalities that his era naturalized and that subsequent generations have been forced to examine more directly. He is, in this way, genuinely representative of his time. Not a monster, not a saint, a man fully formed by the world that made him, and fully destroyed by the event that unmade it. The Titanic carries all of them. The individuals and the statistics, the named and the unnamed, the first-class suites and the steerage berths, in its 2.5-mile descent to the ocean floor. It does not distinguish between them. The water does not know whose initials are on the pocket watch. The sea keeps everything. It returns only what it chooses. And what it chose in the weeks following April 15, 1912, to return to the surface. The bodies, the deck chairs, the personal effects, the fragments of a ship that had been the proudest statement its civilization could make about its own permanence, was taken together, a message. Whether its meaning was moral or merely physical depends entirely on what you believe about the relationship between the two. Chapter 12. The Artifacts, What Remains. The RMS Titanic sits in two pieces on the floor of the North Atlantic at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, at coordinates 41 degrees 43 minutes north, 49 degrees 56 minutes west. The bow section and the stern section lie roughly a quarter-mile apart, separated by a field of debris that covers approximately 2 square miles of ocean floor. The wreck was discovered by a joint American-French expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard on September 1, 1985. The discovery was made using an unmanned submersible equipped with cameras, the Argo, which transmitted images of the wreck to the surface vessel in real time. The footage, when it was broadcast publicly, produced the specific, collective response that the images of something that had existed entirely in historical imagination, suddenly acquiring a physical reality, tends to produce a renewed grief, a renewed fascination, and a renewed argument about what the wreck represented and what, if anything, should be done with it. In the decades since the discovery, the Titanic has been the site of multiple salvage operations that have recovered approximately 5,000 artifacts from the debris field. These artifacts, personal effects, ship components, cargo, items of every description, have been exhibited in multiple museum exhibitions worldwide, appraised, argued over legally and ethically, and sold at auction in ways that have generated significant controversy about the relationship between historical preservation, commercial interest, and the status of the wreck as the site of more than 1,500 deaths. John Jacob Astor IV's personal effects, recovered with his body by the Mackay Bennett in April 1912, included items that have subsequently become among the most valuable Titanic artifacts in existence. The gold pocket watch engraved with his initials, the cufflinks, the ring. These objects have passed through the hands of his family, of collectors, of auction houses, acquiring with each transaction both monetary value and narrative charge. The specific weight that objects acquire when they are known to have been physically present at a moment of historical significance. The pocket watch sold, in recent years, for over 1 million British pounds. Think about what that number represents. Think about what it means that a piece of metal that once measured the minutes of a man's life, a man who ran out of minutes at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, now commands a price that reflects not the metal's intrinsic worth but the story it carries. We are paying, when we bid on Titanic artifacts, for proximity to the event, for the tangible connection to a night that has retained, across more than a century, its power to represent something essential about the civilization that produced it. The hubris of the claim to mastery, the speed with which that claim was answered, the 37 seconds between warning and impact, the 2 hours and 40 minutes between impact and sinking, the 20 minutes of sound and then silence over the water. The artifacts are the evidence that the story happened to real people. That John Jacob Astor IV was a physical person who occupied physical space and whose body was subsequently cold, and whose effects were subsequently itemized and returned to a family that had not expected to receive them. The watch is the most tangible version of that evidence. It is small. It is beautiful. It is marked with 3 letters that once mattered enormously in a world that has since reorganized itself around different names and different hierarchies and different arguments about what constitutes important. But the initials are still there. JJ. They were there when the watch was wound every morning in a stateroom on the finest ship in the world. They were there when the ship struck ice. They were there during the 37 seconds and the 2 hours and 40 minutes and the 20 minutes of sound. They were there when the Mackay Bennett found him. They were there through a century of auctions and collections and exhibitions and the long, gradual transformation of a man's life into a story. The watch still exists. The man it measured is gone. What remains is exactly this, a weight of evidence that the story was real. That night happened, that the ocean received what it received, and those 3 letters engraved in gold are sufficient to carry a life across more than a century. Chapter 13. The close, the lesson of the unsinkable world. Let's come back to where we started. A watch at auction. 3 letters. A man who was the richest passenger on the most famous ship in history, who stood on a deck in the cold and accepted an answer that his money could not change. The thing that the Titanic story has continued to mean, across more than 100 years of telling and retelling, is not actually about the ship. It was never really about the ship. The ship is the mechanism, the spectacular physical delivery system for a story about what human beings do with the belief that they have made themselves safe. The Gilded Age believed this with a fervor that is almost touching from the distance of more than a century. It believed that technology was the answer, that the correct application of capital and engineering could produce results that were, for practical purposes, permanent. That the Titanic, built with the finest materials by the most experienced craftsmen using the best available knowledge, represented something close to a solved problem in the ancient, terrifying equation of human beings and ocean. The iceberg was indifferent to the belief. John Jacob Astor IV had built his life inside a similar structure of belief. That wealth, properly managed and strategically deployed, could produce a life that was insulated from the worst of what the world could do. That the correct application of the family fortune could buy the conditions of a good life. that the social world, for all its cruelties and rigidities, was ultimately a system that could be navigated by a smart enough person with enough resources. He was not wrong, exactly. He had navigated it, imperfectly, unconventionally, at some cost. He had found his patents and his science fiction novel, and his second marriage, and his genuine happiness in small things. The gym on the ship, the dog on the deck, the young wife in the adjacent stateroom. He had found a version of a life that, however scandalous by the standards of his world, was authentically his. And then the iceberg. There is a question that the Titanic story keeps asking across every retelling, and it is this: what is wealth actually for? Not rhetorically, the question has a sharp practical edge to it. On the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912, the wealth that John Jacob Astor IV carried was the greatest accumulation of private capital aboard a ship that had been designed to make wealth feel like protection. And it protected nothing. Not in the end. Not from the mathematics of 12,000 feet of cold, dark water. This is not a counsel of nihilism. It is not an argument that wealth is meaningless or that ambition is futile. It is something more precise and more uncomfortable. A reminder that the things we build our lives on top of, the structures of money and status and social position, the careful frameworks we construct to insulate ourselves from uncertainty, are built on something they cannot ultimately control. The sea is always there. Not literally, but the sea is always there. What John Jacob Astor IV had, in the end, that his money could not buy and his social world could not give him, was a character that held in the cold. A composure that was real because it had been tested. A way of facing the irreversible that required nothing from the outside world to sustain it. 3 letters on a gold watch. A lifeboat pulling away in the darkness. An answer that could not be negotiated. The watch kept time for a man who ran out of it. What remains is the watch and the story it carries and the question it keeps asking us. What are you building, and what can it actually hold? The difference always is what the sea decides to give back. If this story stayed with you, if the weight of it is still present, if the question it leaves is still turning, then you already know what to do. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because the stories we tell here are not just history. They're mirrors. And this one has been waiting 100 years to show you something true.